Welcome back to the Commercial Property Podcast. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about how can some investors just spot opportunities that others can't. And, I've got loads of stories from clients where they have bought properties post auction, when they've been openly marketed in the auction room, if by the auction house, and just nobody has known what to do with them, and yet they have done deals that are all money out. I've got clients that have bought properties that have been on the market for a year, and they've managed to negotiate the price down as a result of that, because obviously the motivation has been greater, and they've managed to get all money out deals, or largely money out deals, fantastic return on investment. So, but these properties very often have been openly marketed, they've been in the auction, they've been on the portals, they've um they've been there for all to see. And in fact, there's a couple of case studies that I've used, which are client case studies when I do talks, and I do talks all over the country. Slightly kind of pulled it back these days, but I still go out and about to some really key meetings that I like. I love going out and meeting people, and sharing the love about commercial. And I've pulled these case studies up, and I've got clients who, sorry, not clients. I've got people coming up to me saying, "Oh my goodness, I looked at that. I didn't know what to do with it, or I saw that, and so that these are things that are in plain sight. I'm not talking about doing off market campaigns, or buying through commercial agents. Of course, all of these are great ways to find properties. These are properties that are on Rightmove Commercial. They're in auction houses. They're on LoopNet. So how can some investors spot the opportunities with those kind of deals, that are basically hiding in plain sight, and other people just can't see it? The difference isn't access. These people who are doing these deals, these clients who are doing these deals, they're not doing they're not looking on special portals, or they haven't got some special prop tech. So the difference isn't access, it's actually perspective. And that's what I want to talk to you about in this episode. So one of the kind of myths I want to bust is that successful investors have access to secret deals that nobody else knows about. That's rarely true. Now, one thing as a kind of caveat to that, I would say, is that when you have been investing for a little while, you will have built relationships. And now that's one of the reasons why I talk about niching a lot, because when you build relationships in your chosen niche, first of all, it's a lot easier to build relationships when you are in one area or in one sector, because the number of agents, the number of stakeholders you need to speak to is a lot less, are a lot less. So that's a real benefit of that. And actually, when you've bought a deal from an agent, or you've been active in a market long enough, you will send deals off market. That's just the way the commercial property market works. So you do get access to more deals, but that's by doing deals, or by being consistent, lots and lots of activity, building relationships, building rapport. The commercial property market is a very sociable market, kind of meeting them socially, getting access to these people, it is really important. But there's a lot of deals that are done, especially from first-time investors, actually, who've been on my board program, especially, but also in my other programs, where they found properties that are in plain sight on portals, and so they've got the same access to as everybody else. And a lot of these have been sitting on the market for months because nobody knew what to do with them. Some had failed at auction, others had been reduced in price several times, and hundreds of investors must have looked at these opportunities. The opportunity wasn't hidden; it just was simply misunderstood, and I think that's the really key point. So, what separates these investors who walk away from these kind of deals to those who go on to make exceptional returns? Well, that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today. So, A lot of investors spend a long time trying to find off market opportunities. And obviously, that is a great way of finding deals. I am definitely not dissing that on this podcast. In fact, I would strongly recommend, just like I've said, that you build your relationships, you concentrate on a niche where you can build relationships, you have key stakeholders that you nurture the relationships with them. Um, and you can do off-market letter campaigns. You have to be very consistent with those, but you'll probably get a good rate of responses is probably around 10% for off-market letter campaigns. And what I'm talking about there is where you're writing direct to sellers or owners of property, and you're saying, "Look, I'm an investor, and I'm interested in." In looking at your property or working with you on it or buying it or whatever else. But and off-market deals can be fantastic, but I think people often focus on the wrong things. I think that a better question than how do I find better deals is how can I become a better investor? Because when you think differently, opportunities spring up everywhere. And what's interesting about, one of my clients, Nilesh, he's now built a substantial commercial property portfolio, and he found a property in a really wealthy south coast market town, and it was in an auction. He was just watching it through the auction. It didn't sell. And what he realized was he was the only person that had actually even done a viewing of this property. So it wasn't even a case that people had viewed it and thought, oh, I don't like it or whatever. But because he'd actually been the only one that did a viewing, he knew that it was a mixed use property. So it's got 2 flats above 3 commercial units. Well, what he knew as a result of that is that the flats were in pristine condition. He knew that there was one vacant commercial unit, but he knew that everything else on the high street was letting up really well. And so he had already had the kind of inside track. He was thinking differently about it. He also knew, obviously we worked on this together, but this is all him. He also knew the price at which he could afford to invest. He knew that the price it was in auction at just wasn't worth doing the deal. But he knew that if he could get it for a certain price, it was game on. He knew that he could do a real kind of blow the lights out type deal. And that's exactly what he did. It was on the market for about £150,000 more than he bought it for. But because the vendor became more and more motivated, um, they sold it for a cheaper price about 2 months later after the auction because they just hadn't had any interest. Now, these people who said, gosh, I looked at that and I couldn't work out how to make it work. Isn't that interesting? That he knew, not only knew what he was wanting to pay for it, he knew how he was going to reposition it. He knew how he was going to finance it. He understood what had gone wrong with the previous letting, and he knew how to fix it. And that's what you learn through knowledge. It's all about knowledge. One investor can walk away whereas the other person sees potential. And that's because they're looking at different things, genuinely looking at different things. So what do the better investors see? Well, when I say better investor, I mean more experience, people with more knowledge. Well, they don't just see bricks and mortar, especially with, in residential, that's absolutely fine. But with commercial, it's not just about the building. It's about everything else that goes into it. So it's about the leases. Basically, when you're buying commercial property, you're buying an income stream. That's what a valuer is going to value. And so they will apply a multiplier to that income stream. So who's producing that income stream? Well, of course, it's the tenant. It's a business. So what you want to look at is the tenant's business. Is a tenant trading well? Do they want to stay? Have you spoken to them? What's the future supply and demand for that unit? That's so important. So many people are looking at the here and now, but actually with commercial, we need to predict the trends. So for example, this property on the South Coast, this is a very wealthy market town. It's very busy. It's got other reasons for people to come to it. And therefore, supply and demand seems to be secured for the future. That there's not that many shops. So therefore your supply isn't that great. And because there's a wealthy catchment, the socioeconomics are really good. It means that you can actually, the demand is actually really good as well. You can look at the planning opportunities. You can look at the asset management angles. You know, if leases are expired, what's the potential to renew them? How can you restructure leases? How can you remove break clauses? Can you remove break clauses? Of course, you can anything is possible by negotiation with the tenant. But you know, so you want to be kind of tenant first. Subdivision potential, you know, do you know the market well enough so that you know that maybe this property is sat on the market for a year, not being able to be let, totally vacant. But you know, if you could subdivide it into 2 or 3, then actually it would let really quickly, because actually there's only demand for small units, not large units. And you know that because you understand the market and you understand the fundamentals of why you're investing. It might be that there's a change of use. It might be that you can improve the tenant or the covenant strength. And definitely, it's always about multiple exit strategies. I wouldn't recommend you buy anything in commercial without your multiple exits. So you can see from that, what I haven't talked about is the building. Now, obviously, the location is really important. The configuration of the building is important, although you can often change that. Not always, but you can often change it. The opportunity isn't the building, it's what the building can become. It's which tenant can occupy it. It's whether you can extend the lease. It's all those kind of opportunities. And successful investors ask better questions. So what am I missing? What are my multiple exits? How do I add value? What are all the different ways that I can add value? Because on a good commercial building, you know, you're almost like scratching your head thinking, oh, which one of these shall I do? You know, because there's so many good ways to add value. Why is the seller selling? And can I speak direct to the seller and understand their motivation and work out if there's a creative deal to buy, which obviously means that I can maybe do my asset management before I actually complete. It might be that I can actually create a win-win with the vendor. And of course, that's really, really important. What's changing in this location? You know, is there any inward investment, infrastructure improvements? You know, in Gloucester, near where I live, there's a new motorway junction being planned. And, you know, that's going to make a heck of a difference for businesses around the area. You know, do you understand it? Is there a new major business coming into an area? Is there loads of new housing being built? You know, all of this has a knock-on effect to commercial demand. Who will want this building in 10 years? And how do I get my money back out? You know, what are my different plans? And very importantly, kind of on the back of that is, you know, what commercial finance routes, what financing routes can I achieve? Because commercial is very often it's a money game, it's a finance game, and you can play that game if you understand what the rules of the game are. Now, you wouldn't play squash or tennis or football if you didn't understand what the rules of the game are. And commercial finance is just like that. You want to be absolutely understanding what those rules of the game are. So knowledge creates confidence. You know, knowledge doesn't have to be that you've bought a deal before. Knowledge is just that you've learned what to do. And, you know, you've got a bit of a checklist, you've got a bit of a blueprint as to what to do. You know, people often think that confidence comes first, but actually confidence comes from knowledge. When you know what you're looking for, you stop being afraid, you start recognizing opportunities that others just do not see, and they're very often in plain sight. And I've got anecdote after anecdote. I've got client case study after client case study where this has happened. And, you know, you may not get those deals straight away. I think that's the other thing is that, you know, if an asking price you think is too high, when I speak to, you know, some investors who talk to me about, you know, and they're not on my program, but they're just kind of saying, well, I've just looked at commercial and it's far too expensive. Of course it is. All the asking prices at the moment are far too high, like they're priced wrong. So what you need to do is you need to put an offer out or that you can afford, or you need to track the property, follow up so that you can actually work, you know, you'll get it eventually if you're persistent enough. And if you don't get that one, then you can follow up on another one. You know, it's about waiting until the vendor is motivated enough to be able to sell it to you. And, you know, we're seeing a gap at the moment between buyers and sellers. Sellers think the property is worth far too much. They're basing it off yesterday's values. So, buyers know exactly what they want to pay for it and aren't willing to pay the seller's price. So things are sitting on the market. Eventually, sellers become more motivated. And that's what the knowledge, the confidence knowledge creates. It's not that we have to rush out, get the first deal. It's not that we walk away from things if they look too expensive. It's that you're calmly confident because you have the knowledge, you know at what level the deal stacks. and then you can be patient, you can be confident. And when I speak to my board clients and they're like, oh, I'm so frustrated, I missed out on this, and but I wouldn't pay any more, so it's just frustrating that somebody else came in. My message is always just wait, because patience will reward you. If not on this, on another. What we need to do, of course, is have enough of a pipeline so that we're not having to be reliant on one deal all the time. We want to make sure that, if one does get sold to somebody else, then we've got another deal that we're following up on. So diarizing these follow-ups and making sure that you understand that sometimes you might get a deal 6-12 months after you first offered on it, but another one you might get. I mean, one of my clients, we looked at a property together that had been on the market for 9 months, and we worked out that the asking price was 875,000. We worked out that actually he could get most of his money out, or all of his money out, at around 600,000. And he wouldn't have offered on it, but I said to him, look, you've got to offer on this 600,000, don't apologize for it. Just, put the offer out. And to his utter amazement, he put the offer out and they came straight back to him and said, if you can get a move on, we'll do the deal with you. And that particular deal, he was all money out within 3 months. Now, if it'd been up to him, he would not have put that offer out. But, you've got to have your hat in the ring. You've got to have a hat in the ring. So that one was he got it accepted straight away. It doesn't always happen like that. But, you've got the confidence that this is the right thing that I'm doing. So perhaps one of the biggest lessons that I've learned over the last 30 years is this, that successful investors don't have a crystal ball. They don't have access to secret deals. They've just simply trained themselves to see opportunities different. And that's great news, because that's a skill that anybody can develop. The more you learn, the more opportunities you begin to see. So if you're kind of listening to this podcast, you're thinking, gosh, commercial property is a bit of a dark art. I don't really understand it. I've listened to Suzi for a few weeks on the podcast, but I'm still not quite sure. You just need to get better at what you're doing. You just need to get more knowledge. And that's what it's all about. The more you learn, the more opportunities you'll see. Not because the market has changed, but because you have, because I kind of say to my board clients, it's like putting a different pair of spectacles on. Halfway through the board and at the end of the board, I do a field trip with my clients, and we go out for half a day and I take them through a curated agenda of industrial sites, retail, offices. We go and look at all kinds of things. We look at mixed use, we look at some self-storage, we look at all kinds of things. And I used to do it right at the end of the board. I used to do it on month 6, but the feedback I got from clients was that they wish they'd done it a few months earlier. So for the last couple of boards, we've done it at month 3. And what's such pleasure to see is that I can almost see the scales falling off clients' eyes before my eyes, because suddenly they're starting to look at things differently. It's like they've put a different pair of spectacles on. That's the way I describe it. That's the analogy I use with my board clients. It's literally like they have put a different pair of spectacles on and suddenly they're seeing everything differently. And, that's where you need to be. And, I think that when you're building a portfolio, you don't, you want to see things differently because it evolves you as an investor. It involves you as a business person. And, if the evolution of that knowledge, maybe even the evolution of your strategy, is what moves you forward and makes you grow in life. If this episode's made you think differently, and if you would like to think differently, I definitely encourage you to download my private investor briefing that I've just prepared. The link is in the show notes. And I wrote it to help investors understand what's really happening in today's market. And most importantly, whether commercial is for them. It's more about asking the question, especially if you're a residential investor, as to whether the strategy that you're doing now is a strategy you want to be doing in 10 years. And actually, probably the more important question is the strategy that you're doing now in property going to give you the life you want in 5 to 10 years? Because at the end of the day, we don't invest for just property or money. We invest for freedom. We invest for freedom of choice. And, that's the important thing. if you're already thinking kind of, I'd like to become the kind of investor that sees these opportunities, then, this will help you maybe think about whether it's for you. So download it in the show notes. And if I can help further, then I will do. And, if you, if you do get that knowledge, I can honestly promise you it absolutely changes the game, because it opens up a huge world of opportunities that you just didn't see before. So more on that in another episode of the Commercial Property Podcast. But for the meantime, thank you for joining me, and I look forward to catching up with you soon.